Hello and welcome. Right now, in kitchens all across India, a serious crisis is boiling over. Suddenly, millions of people are facing a severe shortage of cooking gas, LPG. So today, we're going to unpack this perfect storm, what's behind it, what it means for daily life, and what it really tells us about the country's energy security. Let's get right into it.
So this is the big question, right? Why are millions in India all of a sudden struggling to get something as basic as cooking gas? How did a fuel that's so essential for daily life just become so scarce, so incredibly quickly? We're going to break down the immediate trigger, but we're also going to uncover the deeper issues that have been building up for years.
All right, first things first. Let's take a look at the view from the ground. What does this crisis actually look and feel like for ordinary people?
Well, the scene on the ground is one of, widespread chaos. You're seeing these long, snaking queues outside gas distributorships in news reports from all over. And of course, there are widespread complaints of hoarding and cylinders being sold on the black market for way more than they should. This has kicked off a huge surge in what people are calling panic booking, where households are just rushing to order new cylinders, even if they don't need one right away. It's gotten to the point where the government has had to come out and repeatedly appeal to the public to please avoid this rush.
So, how is the government responding? Well, they've had to roll out a series of pretty drastic emergency measures. First, they're prioritizing households, and that means commercial and industrial users are facing massive shortages. They've ordered domestic refineries to crank up LPG production as much as they can, and have even increased the mandatory waiting period between bookings just to try and slow down the demand. And in a really telling move, they've had to make alternative fuels like kerosene and coal available for commercial users, just to keep things from grinding to a halt.
So what on earth caused all this chaos, seemingly overnight? Well, the answer lies thousands of miles away, where a conflict in a completely different part of the world has had a direct and really severe impact on kitchens all across India. The immediate trigger is a war in West Asia, and this conflict has, for all intents and purposes, shut down shipping traffic through one of the most important energy arteries in the entire world. It's completely choked off a vital supply route for India.
And that brings us to this one absolutely critical location, the Strait of Hormuz. I mean, look at it. It's just this narrow channel of water, but a massive amount of the world's energy, especially for a country like India, flows right through it every single day. So when it gets blocked, the impact is immediate.
But here's the thing, and this is really important. The shutdown of the Strait of Hormuz, that was just the trigger. What it did was expose a much deeper problem, a vulnerability that's been building for decades. The real story here is about a huge, widening gap between what India needs and what it can actually produce itself.
So let's look at the demand side first. India's appetite for LPG has just exploded. I mean, it's been fueled by rapid urbanization and all these government programs that brought clean cooking fuel to millions of rural homes. The result? Consumption has grown more than 5 times in about 25 years. Just look at those numbers. But here's the other side of the coin. While demand was just skyrocketing, our domestic production, it grew at a much slower pace. In fact, if you look closely, since about 2017, it's pretty much flatlined. India has basically hit a ceiling on how much LPG it can produce at home. And the result of that huge mismatch is this, a staggering deficit. This number, almost 17,000 metric tons, that represents the massive gap between what India uses and what it produces. It's a deficit that the country has absolutely no choice but to fill with imports.
Now, this dependency doesn't just create a supply risk, it comes at an absolutely mind-boggling financial cost. The amount of money India spends on importing LPG has grown an incredible 83-fold over the last 2.5 decades. It's gone from just over 1,000 crore rupees to over 1 lakh crore. That's a huge bill.
Okay, so this leads to a really important question. India also imports a huge amount of crude oil, right? So why is this crisis so specific to LPG? Why aren't we seeing the same kind of panic at the petrol pumps?
Well, the answer is all about where the imports come from. And this chart says it all. While India depends on imports for over 88% of its crude oil, only about 40% of that actually passes through the Strait of Hormuz. But for LPG, it's a completely different story. A staggering 90% of all of our LPG imports come through that one single, now blocked choke point.
Let me put that into perspective for you. Think about it. Since 60% of India's total LPG is imported, and 90% of that comes through Hormuz, the closure of this one waterway effectively wiped out over half, 54% of the country's entire LPG supply. Overnight, it just vanished from the system.
Crude oil, though, is a different story. India's sources are way more diversified. Lately, we've been able to ramp up supply from other places, like Russia. And, crucially, the country also keeps much larger strategic reserves and commercial stockpiles of crude oil, and fuels like petrol and diesel. That gives it a much bigger safety cushion that just doesn't exist for LPG.
So let's get to our final section and see how all these different pieces of the puzzle fit together to create this crisis, and what it really tells us about the road ahead. You know, when you look at it all together, this crisis wasn't just bad luck. It was, frankly, a crisis waiting to happen. You've got this soaring demand fueled by development, combined with domestic production that just can't keep up. That creates a massive dependence on imports, which are then dangerously concentrated on a single, volatile supply route. It really is a textbook recipe for disaster.
And so this whole episode forces us to ask a really critical question. This isn't just about getting through a temporary disruption. It's about the long-term energy security for hundreds of millions of Indian households. As the country continues to grow, figuring out how to secure its most essential kitchen fuel, well, that's going to be one of its greatest challenges, and it's a question that still needs an answer. Thanks so much for joining this explainer.